In the Homeric Iliad, the catalogue of ships is famous, even if first-time readers sometimes skip over it. Here, we're going to look at how the catalogue of ships functions as a map, and at how it's built around ancient Greek ethnic migration legends. First, a bit of background. The Trojan War has been going for 9 years. The Greeks have been besieging Troy. In Iliad Book 2, after a quiet period, they gather their forces for a concerted attack. It's at this point that we get the catalogue. It's a list of each region of Greece that has sent soldiers to Troy. For each contingent, we get the names of the leaders, the places and cities they come from, and how many ships they brought. You'll have heard that Helen's Face launched 1,000 ships. In Homer, the exact figure is 1,186. But hey, who's counting? Now, the catalogue of ships has lots of place names. There's a heavy geographical emphasis. So, in an age before maps, it's effectively acting as a kind of account of the geography of Greece, and if you plot the contingents on a modern map, it turns out that they follow a specific route. Okay, now, if you've ever taken a course on Homer, even this might be more than you were taught about the catalogue of ships, but specialists have known this for quite some time, and moreover, they know that the route has 2 big gaps in it. That is, the catalogue is divided into 3 sections. Here's the first section. Traditionally, when scholars have paid attention to the catalogue as a route map, they've focused on this section and why Homer follows this winding path. That isn't what we're here for today. If you want to know more, consult one of the 2 big modern commentaries on the Iliad, the Cambridge one or the Basel one. Here, we're looking at the big picture, not the details. So, section 1 here starts in Boeotia and winds its way around the central and southern mainland until it gets to the Ionian Islands and Aetolia. Then we've got section 2, which covers Crete, or Crete, Rhodes, and some other islands of the southeast Aegean. And section 3, which covers Thessaly, or Thessalia, in the northern mainland. Not all parts of Greece send contingents to Troy. The catalogue of ships isn't a complete map of Greece. Some areas don't appear, like northwestern Greece, the central western Peloponnesos, and most of the Aegean islands. The main point for our purposes is that the jumps between each section are quite drastic. The catalogue of ships divides Greece into 3 distinct chunks. And what I'm here to argue is, it looks very much like these 3 sections represent ethnic groupings. Here are the main ethnic divisions in historical Greece. Now, if you can compare this with the 3 sections in the catalogue of ships, you'll be able to spot the central problem pretty quickly. Section 2 of the catalogue is all Dorian. The name Dorian never actually appears in the Iliad, but still, there's a nice tidy correspondence. Section 3 is all Aeolian. Homer avoids the name Aeolian too, but still, nice and tidy. These 2 work just fine. But section 1, not so much. In historical Greece, the region covered by section 1 is a mix of ethnic groups. Boeotia is Aeolian, Evia is Ionian, Attica kind of Ionian. The Peloponnesos has Dorians and Achaeans. Why the difference? Well, the answer is migration legends. Ancient Greeks had several legends about whole population groups moving from one part of the Greek world to another, and almost all of these migration legends are set after the Trojan War. In other words, Homer is just being conscientious about recreating an authentic pre-migration world. The Iliad makes Greece look like what you get if you reverse all of the legendary migrations. The most famous ones are the Dorian invasion and the Ionian migration. Supposedly, 80 years after the fall of Troy, the Dorians leave the region of Doris in central Greece, on the north side of Mount Parnassos. They come to Athens, led by the descendants of Heracles, and they use Athens as a base of operations to launch an invasion of the Peloponnesos, the southern mainland. This sets off a chain of other migrations, and that ends up displacing the Ionians, and so they have their migration sometime later. The Ionians leave their homeland in the northern Peloponnesos, they stop off in Athens along the way, led by the descendants of Neleus, and they migrate eastward across the sea to occupy parts of the coast of modern Turkey. Homer doesn't mention these legendary migrations directly. He doesn't give us a timeline for when they took place, but several later writers do. Here's a table of the timelines according to various sources. The table also shows the Aeolian occupation of Boeotia in central Greece, and the Achaean invasion of the northern Peloponnesos. So next I'm going to show you that if you demigrate these migrations, if you reverse all the legends to recover what an ethnic map of Greece looked like before any of the migrations happened, then you get something much closer to the 3-part structure of the catalogue of ships. There'll still be some inconsistencies, but those inconsistencies are revealing. You see, the catalogue of ships isn't based on demigrating a single migration legend. Homer demigrates Greece selectively. Now, if you start out assuming the catalogue of ships is a Mycenaean document, an accurate reflection of a historical ethnography, then you have to make all sorts of excuses for it to explain away the inaccuracies. But the legendary migrations are just that, legends, and as with all legends, there are regional variants. It turns out that the inconsistencies can be easily explained as poetic efforts to synthesize different variants of the migration legends. The Catalogue of Ships isn't a Mycenaean document, it's a 7th century poetic construct which is produced by altering the contemporary ethnic landscape using false archaism. The most famous Just So story that the Greeks told about these ethnic groups had it that they were named for descendants of Hellen, and they spread out from central Greece. And this is right at the start of Greek mythology. Hellen was the son of the very first mortal man, Deucalion. The migration legends themselves are much later. Remember, they're supposed to happen after the Trojan War. Here are our main sources for the migration legends. The most thorough sources tend to be late. For the most important legend, the Dorian invasion, the main sources date to around the 1st century BCE, much later than Homer. That's Pseudo-Apollodoros and Diodoros of Sicily. That doesn't mean the legends are late. The Dorian invasion appears in much briefer form in Tertaios, in the late 600s BCE, and the Ionian migration appears in Mimnermos, around 600. The Aeolian migrations are sparsely attested, but the Aeolian occupation of Boeotia appears in Thucydides in the late 400s BCE. For the Achaean migration and one other migration that I'll be talking about later, we don't have any sources from the Archaic period, so we do need to bear in mind that the legends floating around in the Archaic period probably didn't look exactly like the versions that we have. What we'll do is we'll start with a selective ethnographic map of pre-migration Greece. We'll run through the migration legends and see what happens. Here, in this map, let's take it that we've already got the Aeolians up in Thessaly. The Ionians and Achaeans are in Attica and the Peloponnesos. We're not worrying about the gap in the middle of the Peloponnesos, Arcadia, because they aren't related to Hellen's family tree. The Arcadians don't move around. The Greeks thought of them as autochthonous, meaning they are supposedly the original inhabitants of their region. So, off we go. Let the migrations begin. Phase 1, according to the timeline we get in ancient sources, is that 60 years after the Trojan War, an Aeolian tribe called the Voiotoi are driven out of Thessaly. The Aeolians also migrate across the sea, to Lesvos and the northern part of Asia Minor, but we're not worrying about them just now. We're looking at the mainland. And, hey presto, Boeotia in central Greece is now an Aeolian region. Phase 2, the Dorian invasion. The descendants of Heracles lead the Dorians to invade the southern and eastern Peloponnesos. This is usually put 80 years after the fall of Troy. But there were Achaeans living in the southern Peloponnesos. What happens to them? Phase 3, the Achaean migration. The Achaeans occupy the northern Peloponnesos, led by a son of Orestes, the son of Agamemnon, but the Ionians were living there, and so we get Phase 4, the Ionian migration. The Ionians flee to Asia Minor, led by the Neleids from Pylos. Now that all the major migrations are completed, that gets us pretty close to the historical picture, with the regional groupings that we see in real-life classical Greece. Now, if you reverse these migrations and go back to the picture we started with, we've got the mainland divided into 3 big sections, and that's close to what we find in the Catalogue of Ships. And this is what I'm proposing. Section 2 of the Catalogue of Ships is straightforwardly Dorian, Section 3 is straightforwardly Aeolian, Section 1 is the trouble spot, not so much because it's a mix of ethnicities, but because the Homeric picture fudges some things for the sake of simplicity. First, Achaia, along the northern coast of the Peloponnesos, ought to be Ionian before the migrations, but the Iliad only mentions Ionians once, in Book 13, and that passage seems to be talking about the Athenians. Instead, the Catalogue of Ships places the whole of Achaia under the rulership of Agamemnon, the king of Mycenae. In other words, in the Iliad, we kind of have pre-Achaean Achaia, except that it's firmly Achaean, ruled by the archetypally Achaean king, Agamemnon. And then there's central Greece, the blue region here. Boeotia, Locris, and Evia. The mythographic sources don't give a clear picture of who ought to have been living in the blue region before the migrations, before the arrival of the Aeolians. Minions, maybe? Well, that's a name that pops up in Pausanias, and Homer refers twice to Minion or Homenos, but it's not a prominent name. Achaeans? Maybe. Well, Homer does refer to just about everyone as Achaeans, and it would suit the ethnic integrity of Section 1 of the Catalogue of Ships, but it's not properly attested. Pelasgian? Well, that would make them non-Greek. So, basically, who knows? I'm calling them indeterminate. What I'm arguing is that sections 1 and 3 of the Catalogue of Ships, the Achaean and Aeolian sections, were produced by reversing these steps, demigrating the legends, and fudging a couple of things. But that leaves another problem. Section 2, Crete, and the other southern Aegean islands. What's going on in Section 2? The Iliad famously doesn't mention Dorians, but it does mention Heracleids, the sons of Heracles, who led the Dorian invasion. The Dorian invasion is supposed to be 80 years after the fall of Troy, yet the Iliad puts Heracleids on the islands of the southeast Aegean. Tlepolemus on Rhodes, and Phaedipos and Antiphos on Nisyros, Carpathos, Kassos, and Kos. How did they get there? Also, not in the Iliad, but it's still worth remembering, there's a passage in the Odyssey which explicitly puts Dorians on Crete, using the exact word Dorian. These islands in Section 2 of the Catalogue of Ships are looking suspiciously Dorian at the time of the Trojan War, 80 years before the Dorian invasion is supposed to have happened. What's going on? This can't be explained by a literalist interpretation of the migration legends, but it is explicable if you think of the standard migration legends as having variants. The Dorian invasion is a just-so story to explain how the Dorians got to the Peloponnesos, especially the southern Peloponnesos, but different places had different just-so stories. Let's go back to our list of sources and take some time to demonstrate this properly. First, you've got the standard Dorian invasion legend, which appears in Tertaios, Pseudo-Apollodoros, Diodoros, and so on. 80 years or so after Troy fell, the Dorians and Heracleids come down into the Peloponnesos and drive out the Achaeans. That's the standard Dorian invasion. But there are competing stories for how the Dorians got where they were. Version 2 comes from Argos. Argive mythology didn't feature Doros, or his father Hellen, or his grandfather Deucalion, or his great-grandfather Prometheus. All of them were replaced in Argos by Phoronius. The Argives regarded him as the first ever mortal man, so this is in direct competition with the legend of Deucalion and Hellen. One of the earliest mythographic writers, Arcusilaos of Argos, seems to have had no interest in the Dorian invasion legend. Instead, he casts Argos as the mother city, the metropolis for the whole Peloponnesos. In Arcusilaos, Phoronius is the origin of the Dorians. Peloponnesian cities are named after his children like Spartone, Mucenius, Argos, and Pelasgos. Probably also Epidauros and Tiryns. They aren't attested directly in connection with Arcusilaos, but the context makes it seem likely that they were part of the same bundle. Phoronius is right at the start of the chronology of legend, so all of these are long before the Trojan War, and most tellingly, Pausanias happens to tell us that the Spartans rejected Arcusilaos' version of Dorian genealogy. That is, they had a different variant for the story of where the Dorians came from. So these are two separate stories. Version 3 comes to us from the Catalogue of Women. Now, this poem is part of the Hesiodic corpus. It contains a great deal of 7th century material, though its final form may date to the 6th century BCE. We only have fragments of the poem, but those fragments are substantial. Fragments 10 and 11 talk about the children of Hellen as the eponymous ancestors of Greek ethnic groups. Doros as the ancestor of the Dorians, Achaeos for the Achaeans, Ion for the Ionians, Iolus and the Aeolians. So far, this is all consistent with our first variant, the standard version of Dorian origins, but Fragment 10 also tells us that Doros married Phoronius' daughter. Now, this doesn't look like a local legend from some particular region. This must be an attempt to rationalize away the inconsistency between the first two variants we looked at, to synthesize the mainstream Dorian story of Hellen's children with the Argive story of Phoronius. And one more variant. Variant 4 is a rather special story in Diodoros, who tells the story of Tektamos, leading a Dorian migration to Crete. Now, Tektamos is a very obscure figure, but the key thing is that he's another son of Doros. So, once again, he's very early in the chronology of Greek myth, several generations before the Trojan War, and that means several more generations before the standard legend of the Dorian invasion. Tektamos isn't consistent with any of the other variants that we've got here. The Catalogue of Women's account of Doros' children is fragmentary, but we can see that there isn't space to slot in Tektamos. And, as a son of Doros, he's not compatible with the Argive Phoronius legend. Could he be compatible with the standard variant? Could the Dorians in Crete just somehow be separate from the Dorians that occupied the Peloponnesos many generations later? Well, no. The second Diodoros passage tells us that the majority of Tectamos's Dorians came from northern Thessaly, and that he used the southern Peloponnesos as the base for his invasion. He also brought Achaeans from Laconia, but Diodoros is absolutely clear that this was a Dorian migration to Crete. So, we have 4 competing variants floating around. 3 if we discount the catalogue of women, all incompatible with each other. Variants 1, 2, and 3 are all attested early. The Tectamos variant only appears in the 1st century BCE, but I'm going to stick my neck out and say I think he's genuinely early. For one thing, it appears that Diodoros or his sources were concerned at the inconsistency created by the Tectamos legend. The second Diodoros passage tries to rationalize it away. He goes on to tell us that the Dorians colonized Crete again after the Dorian invasion. That is to say, Diodoros was so concerned about having Dorians in Crete before the Dorian invasion that he decided to have 2 Dorian migrations. So, the Iliad had multiple competing bodies of legend to choose from. Version 1, the standard variant, the Dorian invasion, where demigration requires the Peloponnesos to be full of Achaeans. Version 2, the Argive variant, with Pharonius, and all of the Dorians in the Peloponnesos come from Argos. And version 4, the Cretan variant, where Dorians have already been in Crete for generations before the Trojan War. What the Iliad picks is different variants for different sections of the catalogue of ships. Section 1 is based on demigrating the standard variant. Section 2 is based on the Cretan variant, and Section 3 was always Aeolian. So this produces Achaeans in the Peloponnesos, Dorians, or at least Heracleids, in the southern Aegean, and Aeolians in Thessaly, a threefold division by both geography and ethnicity. As a final note, if Pharonius is Argive and Tectamos is Cretan, where does the standard variant come from, the Dorian invasion? I think there can be hardly any doubt. It's a Spartan legend. Our earliest source for it is Tertius. We're told that the Spartans disagreed with the Argive variant, plus the traditional dating of the Dorian invasion, 80 years after Troy fell, that is 90 years after the war began, is a suspiciously round figure, and it strongly suggests a period of 3 generations, counting 30 years to a generation. And, who do we know that had important king lists listing off generations since the Trojan War? Oh yes, the Spartans. A Spartan king list beginning at the Trojan War was one of the founding principles for the chronographies drawn up by Ephorus and other historians from the 4th century BCE onwards. So, to conclude, for Section 1 of the Catalogue of Ships, the Iliad demigrates the Spartan Dorian invasion legend. For Section 2, it uses the Cretan Tectamos legend in conjunction with the Heracleids. And for Section 3, it demigrates the Aeolian migration to Boeotia and has Aeolians confined to Thessaly. Thanks for listening.